Hey everybody, it's early and everybody else in my house is asleep, so be a little quiet. There's no ukulele this morning. I just finished knitting the scarf, which I think will keep me warm on the bike ride I'm planning to go on this morning. Um, but yeah, it's like 5 a.m. and I'm doing this thing. Because why not? I'm going to talk today about reading poetry and specifically preparing you to be ready to do this week's homework. So this is the first poem I always start every class with that I teach poetry to. It's called Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. We're going to go through it. I'm just going to talk about some of the features of the poem, and then we will answer the questions and the guiding questions in your poetry analysis homework for this week so you know how to answer those. Let's start by listening to Billy Collins read the poem, which I believe if I press play here, that's what I will get. Let's see if this works. It'd be funny if there's an ad that plays first. I bet there will be. Unable to play video. Oh no. All right, well, then I'll just read the poem myself. Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. All right, it's Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. Let's talk about it. When we talk about poetry, we have some different terms that we use versus when we talk about prose. So prose is anything that's written like we would normally write, like an essay, an article. Things that are written in paragraphs don't have line breaks, aren't meant to rhyme or anything. That's called prose. Poetry, the poet decides when the line breaks. And rather than paragraphs, poets write in stanzas. So this right here, before this break up here, is called a stanza. So this poem has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stanzas. A lot of poems will have stanzas that are all the same length. So many of them have like 3-line stanzas or 2-line stanzas or 4-line stanzas. These are all different, right? We got a 3-line stanza here. We have a 1-line stanza here. We have a 2-line stanza, 2-line stanza, 3-line stanza. So there's nothing regular about that. If we look at the poem too, nothing rhymes in this poem. Poem, light, slide, hive, poem, out, room, switch. No rhymes there. That's the first stuff we look at when we think about a poem. Thinking about the title, which is a thing you should never forget to think about, Introduction to Poetry. When I read that title, it makes me think of like the title of a college class, because you will take many classes in college that are like Introduction to blah, blah, blah. Or like the title of like a book that's going to give you more information about something. So apparently this poem is supposed to tell me what poetry is all about. Now, in a poem, the person who's speaking, or the voice you have here, is called the speaker. So the I, this is like a first person poem, that is the speaker. You should not assume that the speaker is the author, Billy Collins, because poets, like other writers, sometimes write with like a narrative character, a persona in mind, and it isn't necessarily them or they who are speaking. It might be some made up imaginary person in their mind. So we refer to the voice of the poem as the speaker. So the speaker of the poem is talking to another group of people, and the speaker is asking these other people to do a certain thing with poems. Let's look at the thing that the speaker is asking them to do. The speaker says, first of all, ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide. So, back in my day, before we had Google Slides and PowerPoint presentations, My teachers would actually bring in slides. They'd sit in a carousel. The carousel would go around, and the slide would be projected onto the screen by light. Now you could take that slide out of the carousel and hold it up to the light and look at it and see what was in it as the light passed through it. Because it was really just like a photo, but made to be projected light through. I'm not making any sense, but I think you know what I mean. So the first thing that the speaker is asking us to do, or this group of people he's talking to do, is just to hold the poem up and just look at it. Like, what's here? And it's kind of what we did with the poem to start with, too. We just looked at it. What's here? Got 7 stanzas. They're of varying lengths. Kind of figure out what the poem's about. Next, he says, or, right here. I knew that was going to happen. That's not what I wanted to have happen. Or, press an ear against its hive. Now, if we're pressing an ear against its hive, the poem is not the hive. The poem is the bees, because it's the bees who make noise inside of a hive. The other thing I should have set up here in this first stanza is because he's saying hold it up to the light like a color slide, we have a simile, because a simile is a comparison of two things using like or as. So up in this first stanza, the poem is being compared to a color slide through a simile. In the next stanza, this one-line stanza here, or press an ear against its hive, the poem is being compared to the bees, because they would own the hive, or I guess maybe the wasps, I don't know, whatever kind of hive-dwelling creature we're speaking of. But in this case, we did not use the word like or as, so this is actually a metaphor. So here, the poet is using a metaphor to compare the poem to bees inside of a hive. In this case, he's using the metaphor to ask us just to listen to the poem. What does the poem sound like? And I did read the poem aloud, but I think it is important that you read poems through a couple of times. In the poetry packet that I've given you, if there's a link, if the title is also a link, it's going to take you to a video or an audio recording of the reader, actually, or not the reader, of the author reading their own poem. So I highly suggest that you consider taking advantage of those as you're going through the poems this week. Next stanza, I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. Here, once again, we have a metaphor. The poem, though, is not being compared to a mouse. The poem is being compared to the maze that you would drop a mouse in. So if you've ever seen those scientific experiments where like mice get dropped inside of the maze and you see how fast they can get through, yada, yada, yada. But here, it's the poem, again, is being compared to the maze. If anything, the mouse is the reader of the poem. In other words, like, just get into the poem and try to figure it out slowly, like you would a maze. You might go down some wrong turns. You might go down some right turns. But if you stick at it, you'll figure out the poem, I think is the thing he's saying here. But don't force it, you know. Or, and here we have another metaphor, walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. So again, the poem is not the room. The poem is a thing that contains room. So I like to think of the poem as a house. You could think of each stanza as a room, sort of. But the idea is just like feel your way through the poem. So when you walk inside a dark room, you're feeling for that light switch, right? You're looking for something that's going to help you see what's around. So just get inside that poem and feel your way around for light switches. Light switches could be just little bits of the poem that you do understand that you can use to sort of illuminate the rest of the poem. But that's what we do. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on shore. This stanza has a couple meanings. Part of it to me is like, hey, just enjoy the poem and enjoy what the author has given to you. The other part is when we talk about levels of meaning, we often talk about like surface meaning. That's like the literal meaning, just like what do you understand about the poem? Well, I know up here at the top that he just wants me to look at a poem. He wants me to listen to a poem. He wants me to feel the poem, right? Those are sort of the literal things happening in the poem. The deeper meaning, the figurative meaning, is what happens when I put all those things together, try to figure out, like, well, what's the author's main message here? Part of what Billy Collins is saying, though, when you first read a poem, like, forget about the big deep message. Just like pay attention to what's on the surface for a little bit. Enjoy it. Don't jump too deep right away. Is part of what he's also saying, and I agree with him completely. But, and here's where we have a shift. I like to refer to this as big but, because it is a but at the beginning of a stanza, so it sticks out. And in this case, it signifies a shift in the poem. So up here we have, these are all the things the speaker wants us to do with the poem, but here's what they want to do. All they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. And here we think of the poem suddenly becomes like a suspect or like a terrorist or something, some bad entity that we need to coerce a confession out of. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. I think what he's saying here is that what they want is just to get to the meaning. They don't care about all this stuff. They're just going to tie it up and figure out, what do you mean, poem? What are you doing? What do you mean? That's what they're going to do with poems. And that is what you should not do with poems. Poems reward a patient reader. And by that, I mean someone who's willing to spend just a little bit of extra time with what is often a short bit of reading. Look at it, listen to it, kind of feel your way around the poem. People who do that are going to get A, more enjoyment out of the poem, but B, they're probably more likely to actually really understand the poem than the person who's just like, what do you mean, poem? What do you mean? And who wants to tie it to a chair and beat a confession out of it. So as we're reading poems in the next 2 weeks, I would encourage you to listen to the advice of Mr. Collins here and the speaker in this poem. And don't just try to jump right to what the deeper meaning is. Like, look at the poem. Enjoy the poem. Poems are one of my favorite things in the world, to be honest. Like, I get 3 poems delivered to my inbox every day, and I always take time in the morning to read all 3 of them, because it always makes my day better when I read some poetry. And I find a lot of beauty in poetry. Poems kind of help me relax when I'm feeling stressed out or other things. So I think they can serve the same function for you if you let them to. Or you can be like the they in this poem and just want to get to the meaning. But you're going to miss out on the fun stuff if you do that. I also think when I read this poem, I kind of think of the speaker as a teacher and the they as the students. So I want you to enjoy the poem. I want you to like sit with the poem and listen to the poem. But I know in the end, many of you will be like the they in the poem, and you're just going to try to get to the meaning, because that's also part of what we'll talk about. Let's take this poem though now, and we can do this, right? This will work. Look at how to fill out this analysis form. Okay, there we go. So if you look at this document, you're going to put all of your answers in the blue boxes. So how many stanzas are in the poem? We talked about that. There were 7 stanzas. How many lines are each stanza? Well, there's between 1 and 3 lines in each stanza. Who is the speaker? Maybe a teacher, but definitely someone who is trying to teach us how to read poetry. What are they talking about? They are talking about how to read a poem. What is their attitude towards the poem? They want us to take our time with a poem. They seem to like poetry. I think you're seeing what I'm saying here, though, right? So sometimes you'll know who the speaker, sometimes you won't. Sometimes just like the relationship between the speaker and the rest of the poem, like the speaker is somebody who likes this thing. What are they talking about is just the subject of the poem. And again, sometimes you'll get a speaker who's clearly mad about a thing. Here it's more like, what is the emotion that the speaker is feeling in the poem? What's the significance of the title? I talked about that. Poetry reminds me of the title of an introductory college class. And again, whatever the title kind of makes you think of, that's what you're putting there. Are there certain words in the poem that stick out to you more than others? Let's look back real quick. I think some words that stick out to me is like, don't do that. I like probe, water ski, right? Confession, torture. So I'm going to just pick like 4 or 5 words here. Probe, water ski, confession, torture. And why do they seem important? I would say, like, when I look at these words now, I think like these words highlight the contrast between the attitude of the speaker and the people the speaker is talking to. Right? He wants us to just like probe our way through a poem, water ski it. They want a confession. They want to torture the poem. Should probably spell torture right up there. Are there examples of figurative language like similes, metaphors? Yes. There are many similes. I always spell that wrong. And metaphors in the poem. Each of them compares poetry to something else to illustrate how we should view a poem. What imagery? Imagery is like, what can I, when I read the poem, what do I visualize in my mind, or what can I hear in my mind, or what can I feel or taste? It's all the sensory things. So in this poem, a couple of examples of imagery are, the poem is compared to not a water slide, a color slide, a beehive, right? Water skiing. Is that how you spell water skiing? It's a weird word to spell, guys. And a torture victim, all of which provide some imagery. So in each of those cases, like as I read it, I could kind of picture it a little bit. That's what imagery is about. What is the overall message or truth that the poet seems to be conveying through the poem as a whole? Again, I already talked about this, but in this case, I would say the speaker is arguing that we should take our time to understand and enjoy the meaning of a poem rather than just jumping straight to the deeper meaning. Instead, as best as you can, try to answer those in about a sentence. Again, my advice to you is to take some time actually reading the poem. Put the 2 things side by side if you need to, but do your best. Some of these questions too, could just be answered with a list of words in a little bit. Do your best. The one that I'm most interested in making sure that you have like a really solid, complete sentence is this last one. Otherwise, just like do your best to understand the poem. Not all poems are going to have all these things really clearly. So again, just do your best to show me that you're at least making a solid attempt to understand these poems. And I would say there's a very good chance that any of you who are in college 6 months from now are going to have to take an introductory literary class at some point. And if you're in one of those English classes, you're going to read poetry at some point. So getting a little bit of a head start here, it will be helpful for you. So again, thanks for doing the work this week. If you've got more questions about reading poetry or any of the poems in the poetry packet, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. But otherwise, good luck to you. I hope everybody's doing well out there. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being awesome. See y'all soon.